Hey, welcome to Podcasting on Podcasting. This is Coach AV Tech. Today, we're doing episode 9. All right, so we're going to cut this here in a bit so that later on, when we upload the podcast, we'll have a fresh cut, a fresh take. You're seeing the live version here on Coach AV Tech on the YouTube. So you may see me stop, cut, start over, whatever, just kind of do that for that. Light's a little harsh here. Let's back that down some. I'm purple now. We want to be more. That might be a little better. Still pretty harsh. I got to fix that. That's a streamer fail there. All right, so we'll start with the title, episode 9, When to Pivot and When to Stay the Course. That's what this is about, making smart changes without starting over. The big idea is a pivot is a decision, not a panic. We're looking at teaching creators how to evaluate their podcast before changing direction. So pivots are intentional and growth-driven, not emotional resets. We'll talk a little bit about when do you change your podcast, when do you change your topics. And we're going to start with the cold open hook. This is for the podcast. And I'm going to have to go over this. It's going to be not every slow podcast needs a new idea. Sometimes the smartest move is to stay put. By the end of this episode, you'll know when to pivot and when to keep going. All right, here we go. Take 1, cold open. 3, 2. Not every slow I can't talk. There we go. Let's go do this again. 3, 2. Not every slow podcast needs a new idea. 3, 2. Not every slow podcast needs a new idea. Sometimes the best decision is to stay put. By the end of this episode, you'll know when to pivot and when to make a change. This is Coach AV Tech. We're podcasting on podcasting. And there's the cut. There's the cold open. There's the intro. Now let's get to what a pivot is. All right. And we're going to start this real quick. What is a pivot? A pivot is a strategic adjustment. When you need a change in strategy, when you need to adjust your topic so that it fits more in your knowledge base or your wheelhouse, or maybe when you need to bring in guests or interviews and then you have to pivot to what they want to talk about. This is based on patterns, not one bad episode. One bad episode should not be a reason you pivot. That doesn't mean you're going to make some subtle changes to improve that next episode, but it does mean that you want to see, if you're seeing bad patterns, if you're seeing bad habits form, if you're seeing a topic that's just not working for you, then you're going to look at pivoting. It's a refinement, not a restart. You don't stop the podcast and start somewhere else. Now, if you're doing a series, that's different. You do your series, and this one we're doing 10 episodes. Episode 9 is now. Episode 10 is next. After 10, we'll look at where we pivot next. So what is a pivot? It's a strategic adjustment. It's based on patterns, not one episode. It's a refinement, not a restart. A pivot is not quitting because your numbers are low. That shouldn't be a reason you quit. If it is, then you really weren't in it. You got to be in it for the long haul, for the topic, for the content, not for the viewers, not for the listeners. A pivot is not changing direction every few episodes. That means you're kind of meandering like a river. You might take a fork here, a fork there. You really don't know where you're going. You need an end game with your podcast. What is that end game? It might be forever talking about the same topic. There's no end game there, but you're staying on topic. If you're changing topics just because you've lost things to talk about in that topic, it wasn't a great topic to begin with, or it was just partially planned. If you fail to plan to fail. It is not starting over to feel productive. So sometimes you can get a fresh start, a break, a reset. That's not a pivot, that's a reset. There's a difference there. If you haven't stayed consistent, you haven't stayed long enough to judge. That's a big statement right there. So stay consistent so you can judge when you need to pivot. Reasons you should not pivot. And I got very loud there. You should not pivot. Don't pivot if you've only released a few episodes. You need more practice. Practice, practice, practice. That's how you get to Carnegie Hall. Do not pivot if you're still building your consistency of when you're releasing episodes and how frequently that is. Do not pivot if you're learning the basics of podcasting or live streaming. That's you got to get better, and you don't get better by making constant change. You change the things that aren't working, but complete pivots to something new sometimes don't help early in the process. You don't pivot when your expectations are unrealistic. I need 10,000 listeners, or I'm going to pivot. Remember, your first 10 listeners are more important than the first 1,000. It's unrealistic to find that growth. It's like a lottery. Some people do find it. It's just not normal. Early silence is normal. Remember, that's a reality check, people. Not reaching anybody at first is the norm. It is not becoming viral. Signs it might be time to pivot. Consider a pivot if you're consistently publishing but deeply disconnected to the topic. You don't care about the topic anymore. It doesn't work for you. That might be time to consider a pivot. The format doesn't fit your goals. That's a time to pivot to a new format, maybe a new platform. Your audience feedback is clear and consistent that you should pivot, that people don't like what you're saying, no one's listening, but yet they've listened and given you feedback and you're not listening to it. I guess that makes sense. Maybe you've outgrown the original idea. The original idea of this podcast is on podcasting, but we're going to do 10 episodes on it. We might come back to a future series on podcasting, but we're going to pivot to a new direction, kind of where the Coach AV Tech goes. Boredom after discipline is different than boredom before consistency. Think about that. If you're bored after you've been disciplined and consistent about something, it's different than being bored before you're consistent. Before you're consistent means you haven't worked the topic out, you haven't worked the plan out. If you're bored after you're disciplined, that you've done all these things and you've checked all the boxes and you've done it multiple times and you're still not getting anywhere, that might be time to pivot. Let's look at pivots, smart pivots, not full restarts. There's a format pivot from solo to the interview. You're tired of just talking to yourself. So you bring in someone to talk to. You ask them questions. You have an interview, discussion, dialogue. That's a format pivot. Long episodes to shorter segments. Do you want to go from the lengthy, longer podcast to the shorter, more social media style? Well, that's a format pivot. Loose talk versus structured topics. We're on structured topics here. So if I just wanted to get on here and talk about, World of Warcraft, that would be a loose topic that I'm interested in, but you may not be. So you got to look at the format pivots. Are you changing the way in which you're delivering? Now we're going to look at audience pivots. Narrow the focus to specific audiences. That's where you're going to pivot to a different audience. Clarifying who it's for. Who's this audience for? And maybe I need to change my topic just a little bit to find that audience. Adjusting my language and my examples. Who am I talking to? What am I talking about? And how am I making the metaphors and similes that make it work for them and make them see the visual of what I'm trying to say? There's also the content angle pivot. Same topic, new lens, a different way to look at it, a different point of view. You could be more practical. Another type is to be more practical than less general. Like, how are you using this in everyday world? You could get deeper instead of broader. Stop talking about all the things in a topic, but maybe talk about the deep. I use the water ski versus scuba dive. If you're broad, you're just skiing across the lake. You're covering the whole lake, but you're not going very deep. You're on top. You're just skimming the water. But if you go scuba diving into one specific part of the lake, you learn a lot more about the lake going deep down. But there's a lot to scuba dive on. There's also a lot to ski on. So I use the deeper instead of broader approach. You can pivot within your podcast. Just make sure you're not, doing it for the wrong reasons. When to start a new series instead of changing everything. Start a new series if you want to test a new idea. You're exploring a related topic to the topic you're talking about. You don't want to confuse existing listeners when you start a new series. So if you're just changing the series to change You're not continuing the old one. They're going to tune in and they're going, why are they talking about Warcraft? Why are they talking about, something else? They don't understand. So keeping a series intact means you could do multiple podcasts. That does add to the workload, but you're going to, sell that series as something different. Series lets you experiment without burning the whole house down, so you can change topics, but yet keep your topics. And it adds to the workload, as I said. You can use data without letting it control you. You're going to look at episode completion. How well were you at completing your episodes and your process and your plan? You're going to look at repeat listeners. Who's coming back to listen to the podcast each week, month, or whatever your consistency is. You're going to look at listener feedback. What are the comments? What are the emails about? You're going to ignore off again spikes. One episode may have been great, but it might have been shared by someone who sent it viral, not maybe because the topic was on target with your audience. That's where social media comes in. It can kind of play tricks on the brain. Comparing yourself to the big shows, ignore that. You're not the big show. You can emulate it, but don't compare your analytics to it. They're way ahead of you. You might get there one day. You might not. Who knows? Look out for the vanity metrics early on. Later on, that works for the little key differences, but early on, the vanity metrics about who's listening, how many listeners I got, what it looks like, who's staying around, who's listening the most. Let's look more at those consistent listeners. Data informs your decisions. It doesn't make them for you. Use the decisions you make, or the data, you get as a tool, not the reason you're doing something. Let's look at the stay the course test. Before pivoting, ask yourself, have I been consistent? Have I improved my workflow? Have I given this enough time? If the answer is no, stay the course. Why are you changing? Those three questions, consistency, workflow, and time, they're the key to being successful at this, at least starting. Pivoting with intention. If you do pivot with intention, explain it to your audience. Keep a familiar element from the previous topics. Commit to the new direction. Don't just dabble in it. A clear pivot builds trust. A random resets and breaks it. Some closing thoughts here. We've looked at the pivoting and some things like that. I'm looking for listener action. Most growth happens after you want to quit, when you leave it out there and people find it. An action step. Look at your last few episodes. Maybe you got 3, maybe you got 2, maybe you got 5. Look at them. Identify one thing that you want to refine or replace. Check that. Identify one thing you want to refine, not replace. We don't want to replace a topic or a part, but we want to refine it and make it better. What can we do better? Next, we're going to talk about the long game of podcasting. Episode 10, our finale for this series, is what success actually looks like for me. We're going to talk about, kind of review what we've learned in this series. Go back through the key points that I've probably repeated several times. But we're going to look at the long game. We're going to look at what this looks like for you. What do you consider success for you? Is it making it big time, viral, or is it just sharing the information? That's up to you personally, what you want to do. And you need to make sure you're making informed decisions based on what you already do, your consistency, and how well you do it. This is Coach AV Tech. We're podcasting on podcasting. Thanks for listening. All right. So, there we go. We got that part done. We'll be looking at where we go long game podcasting, and then we're going to make a pivot to a new series. I'll let you know a little bit more about that. I've dropped some hints into it. If you're smart, you'll